From DLA Piper, this is the U.S. Latin America Panorama Podcast. This podcast series focuses on the latest developments across the Americas and globally, highlighting business, legal, economic, and political developments affecting businesses daily. This episode features Francisco Cerezo, partner and chair of the U.S. Latin America practice, entitled From U.S. Security and Intelligence Services to the Private Sector, Navigating and Mitigating Risk, a conversation with DC Page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of the DLA Piper Latin America Panorama podcast series. We're thrilled that you joined us again. It's been extremely well received in the market, and we've talked about all sorts of issues from current affairs to AI to connectivity from the UK and Spain and Iberian Peninsula to Latin America and a number of other issues. And I'm really delighted to have a special guest today as we talk about trends in Latin America and globally. What our guest today is really a thought leader and a leader in the market and is vital to essentially cross-border transactions, foreign direct investment and whatnot. I had the pleasure of meeting DC Page. So welcome, DC. Thanks for joining us. Really delighted to have you. I met DC 20 plus years ago when I was a younger attorney working with another firm, and a client worked with DC. And at the time he was with another firm providing business intelligence and all sorts of different services to the client, which was really fascinating. It was really my first exposure at the time, 20 something years ago, into this world that DC, again, he and his firm, B2 Global, are market leaders in. And we frequently collaborate with them, or we have clients who turn to their services. So it goes from everything from business intelligence to very sophisticated due diligence to security solutions in the entire meaning of the word, includes cybersecurity to physical security for natural persons, for the corporations. It's really a wide range. And we rely on them on everything from transactions to market intel to country risk and how you mitigate risk. So with that said, by way of a little bit of introduction, let me mention DC used to be in public service and will tell us a little bit about his bio. He was in government service where he held some high-level positions in intelligence and law enforcement and then transitioned to the private sector. So we're delighted to be able to have this conversation today. My old friend and collaborator, DC Page. Welcome, DC.
Boy, thank you so much for having me, Francisco. It's great to be here.
So, DC, as we get going, why don't you tell us a little bit about the background? Because I think we want to do a deep dive on what you do at B2 Global, how you work with clients in risk mitigation, navigating risk, evaluating risk, and whatnot. But let's rewind a little bit and maybe a little bit of background. Let's set the table, if you will, of a little bit of your background. I know you started in law enforcement certain decades ago, I think in the Midwest. So maybe if you could give us a brief history of how you got to this point of your trajectory in law enforcement, intelligence, and then transition to the private sector. That'd be a great way to start and set the table.
Right. Yeah. Happy to do that. And my background is somewhat indicative to my colleagues and people in this space. So it's good to provide that and some context. So very interesting background. I started in law enforcement when I was 19 years old. The age of majority was 18 in those days in Wisconsin. I was actually not hired to be a police officer, but actually an undercover agent, and not actually an undercover agent, a deep cover agent. So that's where they change your complete identity and you actually live your part. And it was an exciting time, especially being a 19-year-old. And I had the opportunity, inadvertently, I'll say that, to infiltrate the Chicago Mafia. And I say inadvertently because I was actually working in rural Wisconsin buying drugs. And turned out that the Chicago Mafia, they would play up there, and I stumbled upon them. So I did that for a couple of years, stopped college to do that job. And the deal was that if I do take a break from college, they'll pay for the rest of my school. So my career jettisoned to Washington, D.C., where I finished my university at American University, and I was recruited by the feds there. And I became a special agent for, in those days, which was called the Customs Service, which is now Homeland Security. An interesting role and why I went with them is the Customs Service, number one, enforces more laws than any other enforcement agency in the federal government because it always has some context to the border. And I specialized in two areas. One of them was money laundering investigations and prosecutions, but money laundering as it related to many, many different offenses. It could be narcotics trafficking, it could be fraud, it could be the espionage and the like. Then that role took me into what we call the diversion of high technology and military armaments to embargoed countries. And I will say our biggest adversary was the Soviet Union, which is going to tell you how old I am. So basically, it was a game of capture the flag. The Soviets and countries like Iran and Iraq that were embargoed would come to the U.S. and try to steal our technology or our weapon systems and then reverse engineer them for themselves. So we would try to catch them before they got back there. So it was one of those agencies where we had a dual enforcement and intelligence role. So that was my career in law enforcement as a special agent working, as you mentioned, on both sides, enforcement and intelligence. I transitioned into the private sector to probably one of the leaders in our space now, which in those days it was private investigations, but that's morphed into more sophisticated business intelligence. And we worked Wall Street. We did a lot of just about every deal that was going through Wall Street in those days. We were a part of and really changed this industry into something that did a better job supporting not only the financial sector, but the legal community and obviously multinational corporations.
I know the company that you transitioned to, the firm, which is certainly is still well known and for many years was the leading firm. When you went to work with them, were you focused in one particular area, whether it's geographically, whether it's the Americas, US, Latin America, a particular sector? What was essentially the portfolio when that transition from being in the public service with customs and intelligence and law enforcement to private sector? Was it focused in one sector, one geography? Was it a broader portfolio? What was the initial portfolio in that first gig, if you will, when you went to that firm that you worked with several decades ago?
Right. So I started with them in Los Angeles. So we were somewhat geographically divided up, but our expertise took us throughout the globe because what we do is mainly the gathering and synthesis or analysis of information. That's really what our role is. So that applies to just about any sector, any space, any specific issue, any specific litigation, deal, whatever it may be. So no, we worked a wide range of things. And my background was very international because of the money laundering projects and prosecutions I worked on. So I worked everywhere.
You're now based in Miami, although I know you basically travel the globe and you cover the globe. So your firm that you're the senior managing director, which you're one of the founders of it, and you have several partners that are also folks with really interesting backgrounds in intelligence and in law enforcement, V2 Global. You're based in Miami, but you have a global coverage. So give us a sense of the universe of what you cover. People turn to V2 Global for a number of reasons. So if you could walk us through what V2 Global does generally, and then we'll start getting granular by region, by how you help clients navigate risk or whatnot. But if you could start by you giving us a sense of what V2 Global offers in its portfolio to clients.
Right. So V2 Global is a risk mitigation firm. Basically, we manage risk for multinational corporations. And DLA Piper, you represent multinational corporations, whereas we work with counsel all the time. At the end of the day, we're working for these multinational corporations. So managing risk for them entails a lot of different things. And as I said, the apparatus is mainly to gather information and then analyze it in a way to attain our client's objective. And that could be anything. It could be litigation support, due diligence, transaction. It could be contract dispute. It could be a myriad of issues that we address. So the business itself takes that ability to gather information and to solve problems and issues for our clients. We're basically problem solvers. Typically, our clients come to us when they don't have the internal apparatus, whether it be a law firm, whether it be a corporation or whatever, to handle that particular problem or event. Some of them could be fairly routine, but maybe more complex. And the more complex ones involve multi-jurisdictions. And it's hard for many firms, corporations themselves, even law firms, although you have a global footprint and you can relate to this, but it's difficult to work in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. And most issues these days are global in nature. So that's where we built our apparatus. How we built it was to be able to have that global footprint. We're based in Miami, so Miami is the front door to Latin America. So we tend to have more work and focus in Latin America, which we're very proud to do. And it's a great region to work in. And I've got a great affinity for the region coming from Wisconsin. So many of the projects will take us to Latin America. We may start in Miami, and the deal may have components in Europe and Switzerland. It may have investors from other parts of the world in Asia, so on and so forth, that become a critical part of a particular project.
One of the things that I find interesting is that people from the outside, unless they're exposed to a firm like yours, like V2 Global, and get a more nuanced sense of the wide range of services that you could offer and areas that you could assist with, if you don't have the experience of working with firms like you may think that everyone comes from a hardcore law enforcement or intelligence. But one of the things that maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the broader strokes of the people on your team. I mean, people on your team that I've met were former bankers and worked in investment banking, because the approach is not only hardcore law enforcement, if you will, but it's kind of a more 360 view, which of course you have some of your colleagues do come from, whether it's DEA or police departments or whatnot, but also from financial services industry. If you could talk a little bit more about that. The profile of the team is not always necessarily dyed-in-the-wool law enforcement. Yeah. It comes from a really diverse background to provide this comprehensive suite of services. If you talk a little bit more about those type of profiles of folks in your industry.
Right, and appreciate that observation on your part, that in order to be able to gather all this information and data and intelligence, we do need a diverse group. And it starts with our research analysts, and they are probably some of the best, and they're very specific to the industry. Many law firms like to say, oh, well, we have our paralegals or whomever there. And yes, I can't do paralegal work. My analysts can't do that, but they can't do what we do, because it takes a special talent, and you have to have a little bit of gut instinct, a little bit of that investigative prowess, and the tools that allow them to go in different directions. Researching something for an investigative objective is different than legal research. So the databases that we use, the information sources that they have are very, very specific to investigations, but need to be diverse in their own right. So we start with the analysts, and again, specialists in their area. They'll typically do that first level research. Then we have our investigators, which are the field investigators. They do the groundwork. If we need to go out and get specific information from a courthouse, whatever it may be on the ground, conduct interviews, surveillance. Believe it or not, we do a lot of surveillance. Trash pulls. We're pulling trash all the time, and it's an interesting source of information and provides a lot of insight. And done properly, it's absolutely legal, so it has evidentiary value. And those investigators are also specific to their geographic area, so that now you have language and cultural expertise in that specific area. Then we rise up to more of our experts, which are specific experts. You mentioned that the financial sector, and one of my partners and several people in the firm come from a banking background, Wall Street and the like. We have lawyers on our team because all of our issues have always some context or legal component to it. We're not practicing law, but we want to make sure that evidence is gathered properly, that it's transmitted properly, that we're working within the rules of whatever jurisdiction we're operating in. So those experts also include our cyber team. We have a cyber forensics team. We have a cyber security team. Big part of our work these days in the crisis management side is the attacks, hacks, things like that we're always trying to prevent, but more times than not, we're responding to and cleaning up and remediating. We have financial forensics experts, and then we get into access to handwriting experts, audio experts, all these different specialties out there. Then the law enforcement component comes in here, whereas the core team with V2 Global is a law enforcement, intelligence, and military background. That's for a reason. It's mainly because of our background history, which develops our investigative skills, number one, but mainly our contacts and abilities to navigate complex issues around the world. And we use those contacts to support our investigations. I mentioned one of my partners is a former Wall Street banking lawyer, and he used to be a client. And he says, the reason I like to use V2 is because I can do a due diligence on a deal anywhere, and a lot of firms can take care of that, and you get a long report with all the database runs and open source information. But what we do is we use our backgrounds and our connections to check our work, to actually backstop it. So if we're doing a due diligence on Francisco Cerezo and wherever, we'll go through the normal open source intelligence, we'll compile a report in that, then we'll go to our sources and say, hey, tell us about Francisco. Do we miss anything or do we get it right? And those are typically law enforcement or intelligence contacts that I know they wouldn't have anything on you, but in some cases, the open source intelligence isn't enough. And more importantly, it checks our work, and we can tell our clients that not only this is what we saw, but we verified it. So that's the complex nature of the team that makes up our staff.
So you mentioned cybersecurity, and we'll get into that because it's a brave new world and all the issues that come with cybersecurity and AI and whatnot, which is top of mind these days. But let's rewind a little bit. I mean, things have changed a lot since you started. So the security and intelligence landscape globally and in Latin America certainly has shifted over the last decades. When you look today to your clients, global companies, multinationals, multilatinas, significant family groups, private equity funds, I know you work with a whole range of clients. What were the reasons they were turning to you, let's say 10 years ago or even 15, 20 years ago versus today? What kind of shifts have you seen, areas that they're asking you to focus more on, or you see of greater relevance or importance?
So initially, years ago, it was always more volatile markets that we would get called in to work with our clients on. And now those people and businesses and corporations at the direction of counsel are saying all markets are becoming somewhat volatile. Everything from the political environment to the security environment to the legal environment, rule of law is changing in these countries and how you operate. So whereas we used to be focused on more, like I said, volatile, hostile, or rough environments. Now we're getting called to work in just about every country because the landscape has changed. There's so many other influences affecting businesses trying to operate in these jurisdictions. This is an extreme example, but we were working with a company that was trying to perform a simple bankruptcy, and the company had a large presence in Nicaragua, and a New York bankruptcy company in Nicaragua, just a bankruptcy that was moving into liquidation. But you couple that with a dictatorship down there, and it became very, very, very complex. And then trying to deal with the government, and they were trying to nationalize it before the bankruptcy could proceed, so on and so forth. And again, an extreme example, but there's a lot of other jurisdictions, especially through Latin America, that are changing now where you really have to be careful of all of the different legal, social, cultural, and now political changes that are taking place.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many, it's so fluid, right? The changes in government and whatnot. So you have to be nimble and be able to navigate those political changes, social changes, economic changes across the region or globally indeed. Can you walk us through? So a client comes and says, I have an issue. How do you gather, analyze, and start devising a plan in terms of risk mitigation? Walk us through, or maybe we could break it down to more, because I guess people can approach you for so many different reasons. Maybe let's start with due diligence, which is a simple one. And a lot of our listeners are looking to make an investment in another country or in a business that has multiple jurisdictions and whatnot. Day one, you're sitting with a client or with the outside advisors, which could be bankers or lawyers that turn to you and bring you into the team. What's the focus that you bring, and how do you start breaking down getting a proper due diligence done on a target company that has possibly subsidiaries across different regions of Latin America, different parts of Latin America, or indeed the globe? Walk us through that process.
Right. So many times we're hired to check the box. We have to do due diligence. Let's call V2 Global, DC Page, or another group to do that. Bang, we've taken care of that. But those, especially counsel in that, realize we really have to do something to make sure we're protecting the shareholder value and obviously the reputation of the company. So we're going to start by interviewing the client, as you would, and try to see if there are any issues there that might be of concern or that they see before we get started. The due diligence is we typically take the entity, we start with all the basics, the regulatory side of things, make sure they're registered, incorporated properly, so on and so forth. There's land, is it owned properly, how is it held, and the like. And we run through that. And then we get down to the principles, because granted, they typically will go with the company in a deal, and there's a reputational side of that that needs to be addressed. And then we will divide those up, and those will literally be almost separate investigations, because there's different ways to approach a company than an individual, and every jurisdiction's a bit different. So we'll look at those. I have to say, from our perspective, we get a vicarious thrill out of finding issues and problems and that, but that's not our intent. We don't want to quell or we don't want to stop a deal. So when we do see something that might be of issue, we need to get to the bottom of it. And it may be nothing, but we have to get everything there so the collective team can make a decision. And typically typically when we come up with issues, it's more about restructuring the deal. This principal of the entity has a history that could embarrass us, so they can be part of the deal, but they're taken out of a management role, things like that. In fact, I'll give you a good example. Love Brazil. There's always great examples that come out of Brazil. So it was just a financing deal, but a high profile one. And as we're looking through the principles of it, which are mostly family, the patriarch of the family had a very checkered past. And he started in a business. He actually started in, I think it was public busing, which is heavily unionized. And it's like running the mafia. Organized crimes infiltrated it. You have to deal with a lot of tough people. Well, he had quite a criminal record back in those days. Now he's running a multi-billion-dollar company. And granted, he's a pillar of the community, but he's got a serious background, not only arrests, but convictions for major violent crimes. So we needed to get all those details. We were able to document that. And then we worked to restructure the deal with, okay, Dad, you're still part of the deal, but you're not part of the management team. Right. You don't run operations, so on and so forth. So we need to get to those issues. There's been deals where I mentioned the follow-up with our contacts and sources, where, again, this one happened to be in Brazil some years before that, where a very large transaction that everything looked great in the background, the due diligence, so on and so forth. But as we were checking our sources, we found out that the principal was under investigation by the Attorney General for money laundering and tax issues. But the investigation hadn't come to fruition. Well, we're right near the end of a deal, so we had to unravel that. And the client was able to make an informed decision how to proceed. And sure enough, it was sometime later, the criminal case came to fruition, and then they had to deal with it, but at least they went in eyes open. So that verification process paid off in that role. But those are a couple examples of how we approach it.
I would imagine that in this increasingly connected digital world, a lot of what used to have to be done by pounding the pavement can now be done with digital resources online. But at some point, I suppose, when you have to get into the deepest of dives, human intelligence still has to come in at some point. There's a limit to how granular you could get sitting behind a computer. I think you could probably get amazing information that you couldn't get 10, 20 years ago. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be a need for that human intelligence component of that person who may actually have to pound the pavement and dig a little deeper, right? That divide, if you will, of how that's changed from, on the one end, you could do it on a Google search and find a bunch of things on people. But obviously what you guys do is to the next level and a lot more nuance. So that evolution of technology and how you're using those tools, but then still a need. Could you speak to that, of how that's evolved, how technology has helped you, but still the need at the end of the day to pound the pavement and for that human intervention in the process?
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head, Francisco, is that what technology and artificial intelligence and our ability to search things has provided more leads to us. And what I mean by that is we search heavily social media now because people are posting things that are unbelievable that somebody would actually post or have a history of that. So we get a lot of leads from that. And then we hit the good dark web, the bad dark web, and those areas. We hit that heavily also to see if there's any secrets out there. But those provide leads. And to your point, we just can't live by that. Oh, we found a post from a year and a half ago and that. So we now have to hit the ground and we have to verify that information. And by the way, we do that with open source intelligence databases and things like that regardless. Just because we see a criminal record that came up on a database, we now send somebody to that courthouse. We pull the documents to make sure it's right. It's the same thing with what we see in the cyber sphere, which is the social media and, you called it the Google searches, but there's a lot of garbage out there and a lot of, we'll call it untruths or misstatements and mischaracterizations. So we'll head out there, not only verify things at data repositories and that, but start talking to people. And one of the key things that we do in any case, whether it's litigation support, transactional due diligence, is that we talk to our industry sources. So if our targets are in the financial space, we talk to somebody in the financial community, whether it's in Chile or Colombia or the Dominican Republic. We'll talk to people that we know we can trust, and also that will keep our confidence that we're asking questions. And if it's somebody in automobiles or whatever the industry may be, we'll hit industry sources. So then the next step would be, wow, if there's something, recently we've had projects in Mexico where it involved, which looked to be some fraud that came out of a larger deal. And now we have to literally talk to people. We have to talk to people that thought they were defrauded, people that might have been witnesses, former employees, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's what we call where the rubber meets the road and we get to the ground.
So one of the things I remember years ago, my memory doesn't fail me, and this was at another firm. That's where I met you. If I'm not mistaken, one of the things that you were helping a client with was doing an assessment on security for one of their assets. This is for a client in the hospitality space. I think at the time, I know that you guys advise on all sorts of security solutions as well, right? It's not the only thing you do. Clearly, the bulk of it is business intelligence, risk mitigation, risk navigation. But I do know that you also provide, one of the components that you do is advising as to physical security for a business, for a company, whether it's manufacturing facilities and whatnot. So if you could speak to that aspect of it, but also how now cybersecurity, it's not only protecting physical assets to making sure that the manufacturing facilities, or if it's a resort, that the guests are secure and whatnot, and the advisory services that part of your team provides, but also the cybersecurity. So if you could shed more light into that aspect of the advisory services that you provide on both physical security, but how now that's also evolved into cybersecurity being probably at least as important as what used to be essentially just a physical security advisory.
Right. So managing risk for multinational corporations, it's a lot of intelligence, and there always seems to be a security component to that. It could be a client moving into a new market, so we do the assessment on that particular market and the security situation and how much they need to invest and how to invest in securing their operations there. Many times we're called in to actually assess a security apparatus or whatever it may be of an existing operation. These days, it's a lot of supply chain. How do we keep our supply chain, the integrity of the supply chain, keep it intact and that? So we're looking at all of those different types of security components. When we're actually responding to events, I mentioned a bankruptcy, things like that, the protection of assets becomes a very, very important component, looking at not only the people, but the physical assets, commodity, product, whatever it may be. That's a big part of it. So we'll actually come in with many of our clients and develop security programs that will comport with the level of risk in a particular area, jurisdiction, or country. And then we'll also respond to any problems there. We don't get into the man guarding, so on and so forth, although typically, our clients will have a very major event, a shareholders meeting in a particularly high-risk area, things like that, that will help them out with because it's all part of the larger picture. So how that evolves into cyber is that, as we all know, that's now the biggest risk for companies. These cyber attacks, cyber assaults, hacks, the data breaches, and the like. So our cyber team builds programs for our clients. Now, most of our clients, multinational corporations, have a very robust internal IT security team, and we work in collaboration with them. Our team is well suited for the response side of it. So they have a lot of insight into the prevention. So we'll work with them. Our guys are a little more forensic orientated, which is just a different animal than IT infrastructure types that are typically within a corporation or that environment. So we've now put in the preventative measures. We've worked with our clients to maintain those preventative measures, but it's now the response where we see a hack, an attack, and now I have to tell you, this business email compromise, that type of attack. We get multiple calls a week on that. Ransomware, where corporations are phished and spoofed in that. But we're seeing not only millions, but tens of millions, and in the area of hundreds of millions in losses per attack. So it becomes a big deal. And I'll say our approach is to come in and establish root cause in an event. And the reason we do that is when this unfolds, if it was, let's say, a BEC, a business email compromise, everybody's going to be pointing fingers. Who was culpable? And then where does liability lie? So we establish the root cause and we say, hey, here's the problem. It was the finance department's person whose email got hacked, and then that's where the transaction went bad. They spoofed the CEO's email and caused this wire transfer to go to a fraudulent account. Well, then that starts fleshing out, okay, we're now getting an idea who's culpable, who's at risk. And our reports then typically are used for everybody, all the interested parties, the corporation, the law firms involved, the banks involved, and most importantly, the insurance companies that are involved to sort out who is actually liable and maybe responsible for that. I want to mention one thing about cyber attacks. The first thing that I ask my clients when they come to us, and I should make make light of it, but what's your objective? What are you after? And do you want your money back? Because after we look at it, chances of getting your money back are almost zero. The money goes into a fraudulent account and it'll get splashed out around the globe within nanoseconds. And it's very difficult to trace that and actually get your hands on it. Although with these fraud holds, if we can identify it within like 24 hours, many times we can get the banks to freeze money under this fraud rule, but it's very, very difficult. Then my next question is, do you want retribution? Do you want to throw somebody in jail? And again, that one, a little more likely, but still going to be very difficult. And then the last one is you want to identify the root cause, the issue, and then we'll patch it up for you. And that's typically where everybody goes. But it can be a complex process.
As I mentioned, time flies with these things. In the remaining minutes, there's two things I wanted to cover with you. The first is when you're in the private sector, maybe people read too many novels or watch too many movies or series, right? When you turn to former intelligence people to help you with security solutions and business intelligence, that they may be able to get results because they're not necessarily constrained the way that public sector is, because if you're in law enforcement, there's some perhaps clearer guidelines. I mean, walk us through a little bit those ethical considerations. At the end of the day, what you guys do is always done abiding by the law. But private sector, if you go talk to someone, you don't have to read them their Miranda rights, right? Because you're not an FBI agent, but if you interview someone, you don't necessarily have to read their Miranda. So that's just an easy example. But there's always this idea, maybe when you watch too many series, that you turn to these folks that are former intelligence and private sector, and they could get all these miracles because they could paint outside the line. But I know from having collaborated with you and other serious folks in this space that you guys do everything in compliance with the law. But if you could talk about those ethical considerations, also when you're dealing with a matter that may have a civil law component, but a criminal law component, an investigation that you're doing, it's difficult to navigate that. So if you could speak a little bit to that, it would be helpful, because I think so many of us have whether watched movies or series and have this misconception. And to a certain extent, we must say that in recent years, investigations, there's been reports of people that were very high profile that in their criminal defenses hired companies to do things for them, to do deep dives into potential witnesses that probably crossed the line. And those shall remain nameless, but there's been articles in the national press about firms that consist of former intelligence people that were brought in to do background searches on potential witnesses, and it really crossed the line into almost intimidating witnesses and whatnot. There was a lot of reports on that. So, I mean, it could be easy to cross a line. If you could speak about where those lines are and how you navigate those spaces.
Right. So in our space, I mentioned it several times, because of our law enforcement background, because we have members of the team that are lawyers, and that our whole objective is to protect our clients' interest. And if we do something unethical or illegal in gathering information on behalf of them, we taint them. There's been cases where investigators have telephone records, given the telephone records directly to the CEO, and then the CEO started using those direct and not realizing that they were gathered improperly and became a criminal matter. So we're very, very conscious of that. We're conscious of party opponent issues, bar rules, things like that, to make sure we don't step over that line. So the civil versus criminal, I think, is a good way to exemplify that is our work in asset tracing. We do a lot of asset tracing. Everybody at some part in a case is looking for the money, so we do a lot of that. And many times those cases will traverse both criminal and civil. I'll pat ourselves on the back, but somebody in our position are well suited to handle both sides. We're familiar with both avenues, what they need and how they operate. So what we'll do is, in the civil side, we have a lot more autonomy. We have less restrictions in that. One of the main ones, believe it or not, is travel. We can traverse jurisdictions at a moment's notice. Governments, they have to send requests through diplomatic channels or Department of Justice, requests for information or mutual legal assistance treaty requests, things like that. We don't have to. Like you said, we can just go knock on a door and talk to somebody. Now, when I left law enforcement and government, I thought, oh my gosh, nobody's ever going to talk to me again because I don't have a badge. And I found it actually to the contrary. People are a little more relaxed. This isn't as official setting, and they talk like crazy. And it's been very fruitful. I was very surprised at that. So that being said, you still need discovery, subpoenas, so on and so forth. The civil side of it does move more quickly. It moves faster, and we can file orders, we can move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and the like. The criminal is always lagging behind. And the problem with it is if there is a parallel civil and criminal matter, the criminal's always going to take precedent in a judicial setting. So it's a delicate dance that we have to take during those investigations. So our relationship with law enforcement has to be set in a proper way. So we start working with them. We provide them information. We help their investigation along and try to put our clients into the victim's position. And so they get preferential treatment if there's a recovery on the criminal side, things along those lines. But it can get very, very dicey because you have competing objectives in many of those cases. But I found the civil is much more fun, except we can't carry a gun.
Right. So, as they say in Spanish, el tiempo nos traiciona. Time betrays us a little bit because we got to wrap it up. But there was one, maybe even a minute, you could give us a quick sense. One area that I'd be keenly interested in getting your thoughts on. I know your reach is global. I know you manage affairs globally. But in Latin America, a significant portion of our audience is in Latin America. You mentioned Nicaragua, Brazil, Mexico, a number of jurisdictions. I know for a fact that you've pretty much worked in every country in the region. But if you were to look at a heat map, if you will, of Latin America, in these times that we're living, where is it hotter and redder in terms of difficulty? Because whether it's for political risk or corruption or regulatory obstacles or whatever the case might be, for navigating, for foreign direct investment, and how that in turn for you and your clients, the ease in navigating those areas. If you look at the heat map, which countries are you seeing flaring more on the deep red and which are more on the cooler blues on a heat map in Latin America?
I wish I had more time to talk about this because, number one, it's my passion. But I think a quick answer would be that more and more countries are becoming red on this map that you're describing, and it's typically driven by politics. And what's happening is democracy is losing out in a lot of countries, rule of law is losing out, and these political movements are driving the business climate. You mentioned a few things: trade rules, restrictions, currency control rules, how you do business in there. So countries that we've always had difficulty with, Cuba, Venezuela, and the like. Now it's just, there's so many more of them and driven by the political climate. Mexico, Brazil's always been complex, but Colombia is becoming much more difficult to navigate for multinational corporations and then start moving through the region. So unfortunately, there's a lot more red countries in that heat map.
Well, fortunately, folks like myself and our clients have folks like you to turn to at B2 Global. So, DC, well, last question. I'd be remiss if I don't ask. We all know you as DC, so moment of truth. What is the DC? Can you tell us what DC stands for?
I can.
In DC page.
I can and I will, because you're a longtime friend, Francisco. It doesn't stand for anything. That's my name, just the two letters. I don't even have a middle name. And I've had many, many people investigate me, my colleagues in the government, and they've been able to verify it. I wasn't born in Washington, D.C., but lived there for quite a bit. So it's been quite a challenge over the years when I lived there. But that's all I have, D.C. So please call me D.C.
Well, I guess that adds then to the mystique and to the legend of DC Page, that the name is right out of a film noir narrative. So that's perfect. DC, really, I have the utmost respect for you personally and the work you and your team does. And I appreciate your spending some time today and sharing your insights on navigating risk, mitigating risk, and the business intelligence, particularly as it pertains to Latin America, but globally. So DC Page of B2 Global, thanks for being with us today. And I look forward to our continued conversation. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have you back, because a lot of things we didn't discuss that could make for another really interesting podcast sooner rather than later. So thanks again, DC, for joining us.
Thank you, Francisco. I really enjoyed the time with you.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us and listening to DLA Piper's U.S. Latin America Panorama Podcast. Please be sure to visit and follow us on LinkedIn under DLA Piper in Latin America and via dlapiper.com. If you have topics or speakers you'd like to suggest, please reach out to us at dlapiper.americas@dlapiper.com. Thank you for your interest. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.